All right, let's dive right into this explainer where we are going to trace the chaotic, absolutely fascinating entirety of human history. We're going all the way from ancient ziggurats right up to the brink of our modern hyperconnected world. We're going to look at exactly how humanity evolved from these small, scattered tribes into massive global empires, mostly driven by this just unyielding thirst for power, trade, and, well, innovation.
To make sense of thousands of years of ambition, we're going to sprint through 5 distinct eras. First, the dawn of early civilizations. Then, ancient empires and new faiths. Third, invaders of the Middle Ages. Fourth, the Age of Discovery. And finally, revolutions and global empires.
So, let's start at the very beginning with Section 1, Dawn of Early Civilizations. Our journey actually kicks off between two rivers in modern-day Iraq, with the Sumerians. And these guys were absolute pioneers. I mean, not only did they look up at the stars and decide to divide time into hours, minutes, and seconds, which we still use today, but they also invented writing. And once writing hit the scene, things moved incredibly fast. We see the rise of the very first ancient empires during the Bronze Age, which then rapidly gave way to the Iron Age as bronze just kind of fell out of fashion. But with all this rapid organization came a very quick realization about the true nature of power. And this right here perfectly hits the nail on the head regarding early power dynamics. Sargon conquered neighboring cities to build the world's very first empire. And it wasn't for the benefit of the people. It was purely to feed his own pride and gather possessions. This hunger for expansion really set a precedent that would ripple through the rest of human history. It's a stark reminder that human nature at its core really hasn't changed all that much.
Moving right along, we hit Section 2, Ancient Empires and New Faiths.
It is so fascinating to see how humanity started organizing its thoughts, its beliefs, and its letters as these new empires expanded. This whole era is defined by massive intellectual leaps. You go from a brilliant Greek thinker down in Egypt using shadows and basic geometry to measure the actual circumference of the Earth over 2,000 years ago, to completely new philosophies taking root around the globe. We're talking the teachings of Buddha in the East, Confucius in China, and eventually the incredibly rapid spread of Christianity across the Roman Empire, even despite heavy persecution.
But honestly, perhaps one of the most relatable and genuinely genius inventions of this era came from the Phoenicians and Canaanites. They created a brilliant alphabet by simply combining sounds. So, for example, taking the sound ah and the sound ba to make ab, meaning father. It was a system so infinitely adaptable that basically everyone copied it. And the absolute craziest part, we actually found proof of this 3,500-year-old alphabet carved right into an ancient lice comb. It really proves that while our ancestors were making these monumental leaps in communication, they were still dealing with the very mundane annoyances of everyday life.
But as civilizations grew smarter, not all leaders were quite as bright. Take King Antiochus, for example. In this bizarre display of imperial ego, he declared himself to be the Greek god Zeus and demanded total worship. When Jewish people living under his rule naturally refused, he threatened them with a truly weird ultimatum: eat a ham sandwich or else. They, of course, said no thanks and actually managed to briefly establish their own nation again. It just goes to show how eccentric absolute power could be.
That brings us to Section 3, Invaders of the Middle Ages.
So, as massive entities like the Roman Empire began to fracture and split right in half, new groups started moving in, completely reshaping the global map. Over in the East, the Huns began aggressively expanding, which caused this massive domino effect. They pushed Germanic tribes directly into the borders of the Western Roman Empire. You can just imagine the bewildered local Roman citizens looking out their windows and wondering what on earth all these new neighbors were doing in their previously untouchable capital.
And let's be clear, these new arrivals certainly weren't there to just window shop. Germanic tribes like the Vandals quite literally vandalized Rome, looking to take absolutely whatever riches they could carry back to North Africa. But here is the fascinating twist of history. Many of these invaders eventually just settled down, and because they were in Rome, well, they simply started acting like Romans. So while the Western Empire looked totally dead on paper, its culture was quietly being absorbed by the very people who conquered it.
Meanwhile, while Rome is dealing with all these invaders and relying on communal sponges on sticks, or in Greece's case, literal broken clay pots in the bathroom, other parts of the world were accelerating. China, despite going through its own periods of unity and then fragmentation into multiple kingdoms, was busy making massive leaps forward. They invented paper, they invented printing, and thankfully for their citizens, they were the very first to invent and actually use toilet paper, a real game changer for sure.
But no matter how advanced the civilization was, the world's borders completely shattered when Genghis Khan and the Mongols exploded out of Central Asia. When you map out this era, you literally have to stop and ask, wait, how did they get all the way over here? Genghis Khan conquered twice as much land as Alexander the Great, and then his successors doubled that territory again. They completely reshaped the world, opened up these vast trade routes. But they also inadvertently helped spread the devastating Black Death straight into Europe.
Which sets the stage perfectly for Section 4, the Age of Discovery. With at least a third of Europe wiped out by the plague, the continent eventually rebounded with a vengeance. We see the Renaissance kick off, the invention of the printing press with movable type, and this frantic global race across the oceans. Columbus sailed west, trying to find Asia, and accidentally hit the Americas. The Spanish subsequently arrived and violently conquered the massive indigenous empires of the Aztecs and Incas, who, by the way, had been busy building giant pyramids of their own. Meanwhile, the Portuguese decided to bypass the ancient Silk Road entirely, sailing around Africa to build a massive oceanic trading empire over in Asia.
So the crucial point to understand here is that this maritime dominance quickly led to a highly lucrative but incredibly grim cycle. European traders, specifically the Portuguese to start, would sail ships full of goods to Africa. They would trade that stuff for enslaved humans. They'd then trade those slaves for food and resources in the Americas, and bring that food back to Europe to get more goods. It was a ruthless, horrifying rinse-and-repeat cycle that forever altered the demographics and economies of 3 entire continents.
All of this explosive growth brings us to our final era, Section 5, Revolutions and Global Empires. By now, the world was heavily interconnected, meaning a spark in one place could start a fire globally. Just look at the domino effect of the 18th century. Britain, heavily in debt from fighting the French, decided to tax their American colonies, while the Americans hated this and sparked a revolution. The French enthusiastically joined in to help the Americans beat the British, but doing so completely bankrupted France, which then prompted the French king to tax his own people, immediately sparking their own massive revolution. Add the British Industrial Revolution into this mix, using steam power to literally make everything faster and cheaper, and suddenly empires had the technology to expand at an unprecedented rate. Because the world was so connected, the scale of global conflict became absolutely staggering. To put this into perspective, let's look at China during this time. As Christian missionaries brought new ideas to the region, one man had a dream and decided, actually, he was the brother of Jesus Christ. He led the Taiping Rebellion, a conflict so massive and devastating that it left as many as 30 million people dead. 30 million! The sheer scale of ambition and unrest had reached a terrifying new level.
Meanwhile, the remaining global empires were just racing for pure prestige and territory. Russia, which had unconquered itself from the Mongols and claimed the shiny new title of Tsar, expanded across Asia at a dizzying pace. They expanded so rapidly and aggressively, pushing into every corner of the globe they could reach, that a Russian expedition actually managed to discover the continent of Antarctica just 3 days before the British did. Just 3 days! It was a dead sprint to claim whatever parts of the map were left.
And that sprint eventually turned toward Africa. When the newly unified European powers like Germany and Italy decided they wanted colonies, just like the other cool kids, they initiated the scramble for Africa. To justify this, European leaders falsely claimed the continent was unoccupied and just theirs for the taking. This completely ignored the massive, powerful, and deeply historic African empires that were already thriving there, from Egypt and Kush to Mali and Songhai, to the builders of Great Zimbabwe and the Kingdom of Congo. But the race had begun, and the continent was ruthlessly carved up by invading forces.
Which leaves us here. As we hit the modern era, Britain holds the largest empire in history. The great powers are ruthlessly competing, and the entire world has basically been claimed. There is quite literally nowhere left to expand, except perhaps into the territory of the crumbling Ottoman Empire. Take this explosive mix of bottled-up imperial ambition, add in terrifying new industrial weapons like submarines, airplanes, and battleships, and you really have to ask yourself, what happens next? Humanity is